Hey, so this is my sixth video in my series on Voyager episodes that I saw growing up, but they became a lot more fascinating to me once I was an adult. This video, I'm talking about Emanations, the ninth episode of season one, an intriguing exploration of themes like faith, doubt, and societal religion, with a particular focus on societal assumptions about the afterlife. Over the years, I've occasionally heard this episode criticized in the area of its finesse as to be one of the lackluster episodes of early Voyager. Particularly, I've heard it said for the portrayal of some of its characters. I have to admit, I find it a little hard to evaluate the episode's style myself because I was so young when I gained my first impressions. And definitely when you have early exposure to something combined with overexposure, you see it a lot, that tends to put your cheese detector a bit off balance. So I can't really respond to that perspective on it. That being said, though, I have to say that Emanations has remained in my mind over the years as one of the really uniquely intriguing and memorable episodes of Voyager, particularly due to its use of really original, iconic, striking imagery and emotional exploration and stuff like that. And I want to get to that in a minute, but first, let's do a brief summary. Voyager comes to a planet with rings around it. The rings are important. And there are these potentially useful resources there to be found. So upon investigation, however, I think this is a moon they're going on. It's not the planet. Or maybe, I forget. Anyway, upon investigation, they find on this moon or whatever it is, they find these dead bodies wrapped in some creepy white stuff. Of course, they're not actually wrapped. The stuff may look like the webs of a giant spider, but it's a natural byproduct of their decomposition process, so that, like the doctor tells Chakotay later, you were literally strolling through dead bodies. And which the doctor thinks is kind of cool, and Chakotay is a little shocked by. But, as if that wasn't interesting enough, they can't even get home before a portal opens. They try to beam back, but Harry's signal gets kind of garbled and he's swapped out for this newest and latest dead body that the portal was trying to drop off. So Harry, say hello to the underworld. So then the episode follows these two separate story paths. We got the Voyager crew trying to figure out what's going on, but you've got these two story paths of, on the one hand, Harry exploring this bizarre alien culture who sees him as a visitor from the afterlife, a visitor from the other side. And then we get the other story path of Ptera, this girl who beamed on board dead and they revived her, and she gets to explore bizarre Voyager, which is her very unfortunate substitute for the afterlife that she thought she was going to get. So it turns out that these aliens are a race that likes to put death onto their calendar. And they like to climb into futuristic coffins and get teleported to the afterlife by what they believe to be a naturally occurring trans-dimensional portal. Problem is, Harry is their first visitor from the other side, and all he saw was dead bodies on an asteroid. That's what it was. It was an asteroid. So he didn't exactly see what their thanatologists had been teaching for centuries. So Harry's arrival brings some doubt for Hatil, who was about to get ready for his own death. Meanwhile, Ptera, back on Voyager, sees her belief system as completely dismantled by this experience of waking up on Voyager instead of waking up with a higher level of consciousness surrounded by her brother and her other deceased family members. Finally, Harry manages to get home by switching places with Hatil and going through with the transference ritual, i.e., getting into a coffin that zaps you to death so you can get teleported to the afterlife. And after that, Voyager manages to transport him on board and bring him back to life. In the final moments of the episode, something that Voyager does well a lot of the time, I really like this part where Janeway tells Harry he gets 2 days off, even though he's like, I want to return to duty tomorrow. And she basically says to him, you're only young once. Don't rush through life and miss these experiences. Don't miss the opportunity to just take in this experience, process it. So that's Emanations. Now, like I said, it's the unique and bizarre kind of iconic elements that make this episode so memorable to me. Not particularly that they portrayed the characters so amazingly well, anything like that. Probably the most memorable and striking image is the image of this man wrapping himself for his own burial, or in this case, for his own teleporter death. I think that imagery, along with that kind of unique teleporter coffin that they have, it becomes a kind of symbol that pops in your head when you think about kind of the episode, and it's kind of at the core of the visual message that the episode gives you. I think those two images together represent kind of the intended reminder that the writers wanted to give us of the danger of dogmatic religious beliefs that are unquestioned, but also ungrounded. It seems like that's really the primary theme of the episode, the idea of the experience of being forced to question beliefs that have been held unquestioningly by everyone around you. And then that disorienting question of whether you're ready to continue acting on these uncertain beliefs when risk is actually involved, when there's a danger to continuing to follow this faith. In a way, I think you could look at this episode as a reversal of the classic formulation in philosophy and religion, the idea of Pascal's wager. This is something that was named for Blaise Pascal, a 17th century French Catholic philosopher. And Pascal's wager suggests that if the evidence for Christianity is inconclusive, then the rational person, this is how it goes, the rational person will choose to pursue Christianity anyway, simply because more is at stake if you follow Christian teaching when it turns out to be false than what would be at stake if you ignore Christian teaching and it was always true. Now, of course, not the greatest reason for holding to a faith, but that's something that's in our history as humans. And it's the kind of thinking that keeps a lot of people in their particular faith. So it seems to me this episode kind of turns that classic formulation on its head by presenting a situation in which the accepted religion of an entire planet involves commonplace, trivialized death. It involves wrapping yourself in your own burial clothes and laying down in a grave at age 40 if it suits your family's interests. They present this interesting situation in order to ask us the question, what about practicing an accepted faith when, in a case where the line between practicing your faith or rejecting your faith begins to include astronomically high stakes on both sides? High stakes if you continue, and high stakes if you depart. Like I said, I've heard it argued that some of the characters in this episode have a bit of a cardboard cutout feel, but I don't think the focus of the episode is supposed to be on certain complex or convincing characterization. I think the focus that makes this episode memorable and notable are, number one, the unique universe they created with these haunting concepts of wrapping yourself for death and being teleported to the afterlife, and two, the portrayals of distress and doubt, in particularly these two representative characters who experience doubts either before death or doubts after death. So this episode is kind of what they did is they designed a unique and creative cultural sandbox in which to paint a creatively morbid and haunting image of the danger of ungrounded spiritual and religious belief within, in this case, an entirely global culture. Even though these aliens' beliefs about what goes on when they go through the transference ritual, even though their beliefs about that are completely untested, they really have never seen what actually happens. But the members of the culture are so confident of what they will experience on the other side that they casually choose death over inconvenience because it's kind of a shortcut to a better life. It reminds me of an audio documentary I listened to several months ago about Heaven's Gate, which was a small cult that gained attention in 1997. I think it was March 1997 when the entire group was found, their rotting corpses were found dead by ritual suicide in their rental building. And they left behind videotapes in which they happily and confidently shared their belief that it wasn't death they were getting ready to do. They said, we didn't die. That's not what happened. What happened was that they moved on to the next level. That was their term. And so, stuff like that, the unfortunate fact is beliefs do have consequences. And sometimes it's legit for us to say what Harry said in this episode when he said, I have to admit, I find this just a little chilling. And I like that word, chilling. This is particularly the part where he's wrapping himself for death because his family finds him an inconvenience. So he figures he's going to move on to the next emanation. And I like Harry's choice of words. It's really just a little chilling. The story of Heaven's Gate is also very chilling, as well as heartbreaking. But the thing is that stories like that are part of the real world, not fiction. Watching this episode, you can't help but get the overwhelming sense that to Harry and to the Voyager crew, the lives of individuals are of incomparable value. And the casual termination of life for a whimsical reason is horrific and wrong. If a religion or a spiritual practice results in terminating lives without regard for what a life really is, then something is wrong. And we ought to feel, along with Harry, we ought to feel that there is something just a little chilling about it. And along with Hatil and Ptera, we ought to experience some doubt if we're part of that. This episode isn't exactly anti-religion. Along the way of telling the story, along the way of this episode moving along, Harry explains to Hatil that he isn't sure what happens to his own people when they die. He says that among humans, death has been studied over the centuries and millennia, has been studied by medical doctors, philosophers, and theologians, and they haven't come to a consensus on the matter. Cass, when talking to Ptera, she describes the beliefs of her own people. I don't think she says if those are her beliefs. You can kind of interpret it how you want, but she describes the Ocampan beliefs that they're buried in the soil, and then their souls, I forget what they call them, basically your soul enters into a non-corporeal afterlife. And of course, Ptera says that's not what we believe. And then at the end, Janeway, after Ptera dies, Janeway respectfully returns Ptera's dead body to the asteroid where it was meant to be, she says. So the sense you get from the episode, you do get the sense that people probably cease to exist after death. At least that's certainly the impression I got as a kid. But when you look at it more carefully, you realize that's not an idea that's coming from the Federation characters saying so. Really, it's an idea that comes from the plot itself and the nature of these aliens' reaction to when they discovered that their particular false belief was invalid, because they expected their corporeal dead bodies to literally come back to life physically as soon as they were teleported to this place, and this place they would go would bring them back to life. And then that belief is visibly untrue. So the natural result of unraveling that particular false belief is naturally you just assume that death probably just involves ceasing to exist. Just like, when you take a hammer to your computer, well, it's just doesn't work anymore. It's not a computer anymore. And that's something that definitely happens, when people find out a certain false belief is false. It can cause all kinds of other things to unravel. As a kid, I always felt at the end with Janeway and Harry talking, I always felt that Janeway's suggestion at the end was a bit of a stretch, the part where she suggests to Harry that maybe these aliens had their afterlife after all because of these energy readings that are kind of weird. And I suppose I particularly felt that way because Ptera had just shortly before had emphasized in talking to Kes that the afterlife they were supposed to have was supposed to be one where they have arms and legs, just like you and me, that kind of thing. And energy signatures in a cloud floating around a planet, I mean, that really sounds like a shockingly poor substitute to what Ptera was looking for. But that said, let's kind of move toward a conclusion. The way I see it, this episode is so bizarre and visual that it stands out, as one of the most memorable and notable of all the faith-related episodes of Voyager. Maybe a close second would be Barge of the Dead, which is very, iconic and memorable, which is actually going to be my next video in this series. But as I see it, Emanations encourages the watcher to be a little more cautious and a little less dogmatic about aspects of faith that could lead to dangerous or harmful practice if it turns out that the faith system isn't completely true. In contrast to Mortal Coil, the last video in this series that I talked about, in contrast to Mortal Coil, which simply talked about doubt, Emanations, on the other hand, suggests to the watcher that maybe a little healthy doubt would be a good idea. Because of his doubt, Hatil hangs on to life. Ptera doesn't have that luxury. And then at the end, we can't help but hope, along with Janeway, we can't help but hope that Ptera finds something, even if it's not quite what she expected. Next up in this series, I'll be talking about, this will be the final episode on my list for this series. There's going to be Barge of the Dead, another distinctly memorable episode that has always stood out to me, but even more so now that I'm an adult. So see you then.